完了说，大家念心里那一的。
We will begin with the refuge and bodhicitta prayers.
Shinde dobzon chevaye dosir go paramane Pajo lodro shablode ngaje te marindo bando je gunje paros Monde gowa doze pa arya deve shablode Java nile sorai sene Java chishin Jave temba jezeba papa tome shablai so jeve so ne goju gogo bonde sorai namba somboy je kejo yin shablai Beijong bo be zi ji ge sa je namba zhu yuan Gong ye bo bo jun je bo cho je long bu xiang lan Cho le namba ya wa ye wei je zam le gang wa da nyam do zha be be ga ra 觉界常被上乱的罗桑世界日波多变多水你马上我面前被在愿的为界上乱的来不拉松为南干了罗着大外沙外多些国面中间把沙下为界上乱 大年节我南京多多年这边人主人老家人的观点被超多就我东不来说咱们连三节见都用着切不来就为样样乱点把心到进步落着他们 具备松山就跟对的许多宝宝感觉见长这个工作就把他们接了另外一些大多加在才让工作结束进入一节 Lo ye je che da chi ro de mo de bai che je go lo so.
Now, can you all hear me?
Also, 다 너에게 성로리아 도마 자시비에 참주시와.
First of all, I would like to offer you all my warmest and most auspicious greetings. Today is the fourth day of our winter teachings. It's the fourth day of the teachings, so yesterday there was something that I didn't explain clearly. There are the dharmas of Maitreya, the works of Maitreya. There are the dharmas of Maitreya as identified in the Chinese canon, and the way they're identified in the Tibetan canon. And these ways are a little bit different. And so among them, the ones that are identified as being the same in the Chinese canon and the Tibetan canon. So there are many similarities between these two. So yesterday, when I spoke about the ones that are shared between the two, and I said that the Yogacarya levels is one that's held to be a work of Maitreya by both, but that is actually not correct. It is in the tradition, that is not correct, because in the Tibetan tradition, it is said that the Yogacarya levels is written by a Sangha, and in the Chinese tradition, it says that it's not written by a Sangha, instead that it's written by the protector Maitreya. So that is a difference between the Chinese and the Tibetan presentations. The others, the differentiating middle from extremes, the ornament of the sutras, and the discriminating dharmas from their nature are both held by both the Chinese and the Tibetan canons to be the works of Maitreya. And so that is a shared view. So next, What I would like to speak about next is that I will, in order to continue our discussion from yesterday, as I said yesterday, whether or not Maitreya was a historical person, basically the doubt is whether he is a person or some sort of a deity. Normally, we think of Maitreya as being a deity. We don't think about him as being a human. We think about him as being a god. However, the texts that he wrote are present in our human world. So either Asanga took notes of Maitreya's teachings, and you could say that then they were brought to the human world. Otherwise, if there are some treatise written by a god that came to the human world, then that is not such a comfortable way of saying it. In any case, there's a debate over whether Maitreya was a historical person or not. And this is an area where there certainly are questions and one might have some doubts. Sometimes the way we think about things is that we think that contemporary scholars are a bit audacious. And that they look down on our traditional ways of seeing things and they dismiss them. But that's not actually the case. There are many scholars who research Buddhism who have interest in Buddhism and also and have great attachments to the Buddhist culture and affection for Buddhist culture and views. And because they have such affection for it, they wouldn't look down on it or dismiss it. And so for this reasons, they also have great regard for and great interest in the Buddhist tradition. And this is very clear. In particular, in the Japanese tradition, many of the researchers into Buddhism are themselves Buddhists. Many of them are also members of the Sangha. And their research into Buddhism is on the one hand, it is in order to preserve or to propagate Buddhism. It is basically to preserve the Buddhism without weakening. And so they're engaging in great work in order for that aim. It's not, as we sometimes think, that they are just always saying all these audacious things. So if we were to think that way, it wouldn't be right. Similarly, in these days, the general international way of doing things is the way things are going. And the one aspect, this is because of the improvement in the natural sciences that have brought out things that people can see and people can hold in their hands. So if we don't have such evidence, people don't believe it. And since we've come to such a time, even when we're speaking about Buddhism, Buddhist history, since we don't have much factual evidence or factual reasons, if we say it's a traditional teaching, we say this scholar said this, and so therefore it is so. Merely saying that will not be something that people can actually feel satisfied about in their minds. For this reason, many Buddhist preachers use contemporary methods, and in order for common perceptions, they look for the factual basis, the factual evidence. And so if we look at it from this perspective, it is something that will benefit us in spreading the Buddhist teaching, and it's something that we must have. So sometimes the way we think is just too limited, and I think that that's not right. Similarly, if we think about it from another perspective, when we're talking about in the Tibetan Buddhism or in the Tibetan society, a lot of people waste a lot of time on pointless works. They fool themselves on pointless things. If you think about the human life, it's only a few decades long. And during that time, most of the time we spend on pointless and meaningless actions. Actually, there are a lot of things we can do and that we should be doing, but we don't pay any attention to them. And we only spend our time doing meaningless things. And so we end up having a little bit of rivalry or jealousy between different schools or different religions. And people talk about the different rivalries with different people. Or in our society, we think about with different groups or between individuals in society. We have a lot of differences in views, and we consider these to be extremely important and only pay attention to those. And then we waste all our time thinking about those. But actually, we don't have any time to waste. We have a lot of work to do. There's a lot left for us to do. And since there's so much left for us to do, if we spend that time working on such things, then it's like we don't have time to work on anything else, but we don't think about that. This is another thing we need to think about. So the reason why I'm saying so much now is that these people are doing a lot of work whose time to do such work. And so we also need to do work whose time it is. We need to make efforts at doing this and make plans to do it. So that is my main reason and my main aim in speaking about this now. In any case, so there's debate as to whether Maitreya was a historical person or not. But regardless of that, the people who actually organized and systematized and propagated the mind-only view taught in the Sutra Unraveling the Intent were Asanga and Vasubandu. And among them too, the Asanga was born in northern India in the land of Gandhara, in the capital of that, Purushapura. So he was born in Purushapura, the capital of the land of Gandhara. And initially, he got into the foundation vehicle and meditated and practiced that text. And what it says in the biography of Vasubandu, translated by Master I Ching, it is said that he initially entered the Sarvastivada school. Now, according to the writings on the travels of Xuanzang, it was in the Mahishashaka school. In any case, he first entered a foundation vehicle and practiced the foundation vehicle practices, but he was not satisfied with them. Later, he followed Maitreya as his guru, practiced the Mahayana meditation on emptiness, and probably the meditation on emptiness. And so then, of course, here we have the question over to Maitreya was a person or not, because when we say that he followed Maitreya as a guru, generally when we talk about following someone as a guru, we're talking about one person taking another person as their teacher. That's how we normally understand it. And so if that's the way, then we'd think that Maitreya would have to be a person. So once again, the question of whether Maitreya was a person or the human or not has come up again. Now, when we think about the texts or the works written by Asanga, they include the Compendium of Abhidharma, the treatise clarifying the teachings, and the Compendium of the Mahayana. These are three. And now this academics continue to research whether it actually was a Sangha who wrote them, but it's generally accepted that it's said that they were written by a Sangha. Also, a Japanese scholar, according to one Japanese scholar, he said that there are additional two texts written by Asanga. The first of these is the Similarities with the Middle Way. And so I'll give an introduction to that text later. And the second is a commentary on the Vajrasplitter Sutra. And so he says that these two are also written by Asanga. Now, when we look at the works mentioned above, and say that Asanga first meditated on emptiness according to the foundation vehicle, and then according to the Mahayana vehicle. In addition to that, in this text that is called The Similarities with the Middle Way is actually a commentary on the root verses of the Middle Way. And so the name that he called is The Similarities with the Middle Way. Likewise, he wrote a commentary on the Vajrasplitter Sutra. So looking at this, we can say that the most important background or support for Asanga's view is the view of emptiness, the view of the middle way. Not only that, it's clear that the Yogacaras levels had a very strong influence on Asanga. We spoke about the Yogacaras the other day, yesterday. Now, when we say that the Yogacara levels had a strong influence on Asanga, then the question that comes up is whether the Yogacara levels were written by Asanga or not. If we take it as a basis that Asanga was influenced by the Yogacara levels, then we'd have to say that he was not their author because they must have appeared before him, he studied them, and then they influenced him. That was how it would have had to have been. In any case, if we take it as the case that the Yogacara levels were written before Asanga, then we'd say that he based his teachings on the compendium of the Abhidharma and the treatise clarifying the teachings on the Yogacara levels. Now, of course, he did many works and many teachings, but among them, the greatest contribution is writing the compendium of the Mahayana. Because of his writing the compendium of the Mahayana, he kind of revised and recompiled all of the different areas in the presences where the different levels and stages the Yogacara presentation were either mistaken or mixed up. And in this way established an unmistaken mind-only philosophy. So for this reason, the Mahayana, the compendium of the Mahayana is a very important text. And so then, using the basis of Asanga's thought as his philosophy, his younger brother Vasubandu then took that and gave the mind-only philosophy a new and improved form. So that's the way it's generally explained. But among academics, as they do their research, if I give kind of an introduction to the situation with academic research, there are 4 different translations of the Compendium of the Mahayana. And I think this is only in the Chinese. I don't know whether the Tibetan is included here. But it's said that there are 4 different translations of the Compendium of the Mahayana. And so with these 4 translations, when they are compared, the situation that becomes evident is that there are many important points of the Yogacara mind-only pair that appear in the 2 later translations, but not in the earlier ones. So the same text, the translation of the same text, but the text of the 2 are different. There are points that appear, points of the view of the mind only that appear in the later texts, but do not in the earlier texts. And now, the biggest difference among all of the differences, on all the different translations, there's a compendium translated by Master Yi Jing, that is the compendium that he translated. These are differ the most significantly from the other translations. Now, even though there are differences in the translations, if we look at the overall structure of the text of the compendium, what we can understand from that is that the Mahayana is a very systematically organized text. It has a great system and organization. I said that from the very beginning, it is very systematic. So we can understand this from looking at it. So like we think about how is it that the compendium or the main parts of the compendium originated, and primarily it takes as its basis the views of the practitioners of the Mahayana that they developed from their own practice. And then on the basis of that, created a structured presentation of the view of the mind only, and then created the compilation that was later done. And so regarding this, academics basically have no dispute about that. Because it's when at the time the compendium was written, the mind-only view was basically more or less fully developed and had already had its own system in order. And so for that reason, and there's no doubt that among academics that the compendium was written after the mind-only view had been systematized. Now, when we talk about who the author of the compendium was, there are different opinions about this, I think. There's one Japanese scholar who says, according to the one Japanese scholar, he holds that the Sangha wrote the entire compendium himself. Now, others have slightly different ideas. They said it wasn't written by a Sangha alone, but instead is written by many people in collaboration. So there are people who do hold this opinion. Now, another text that is said to have been written by a Sangha is called the Treatise Clarifying the Teachings. When I talk about this treatise clarifying the teachings, what that is it's not in Tibetan. However, there is this treatise clarifying the teachings in Chinese. And what researchers say about this text is that after some disciples had after the Yogacara levels had been completed, it was written after they had compiled and added a bit to the Yogacara levels. Then there's also the compendium of the Abhidharma. Now, the basis for this is primarily the Yogacara levels. Now, within the Yogacara levels, there are many different lists of Dharma. And so they compiled a list and they made it as like a lexicon, like a dictionary or a compilation of terminology. And so they assert that it is this sort of a lexicon. And so then the compendium of the Mahayana, it's like, is that they had the intention of compiling the meaning or the crucial points of the Mahayana into one text. And then also in the compendium of the Mahayana, there's like the complete and the full presentation of the mind-only philosophy. So it was written at a time when the mind-only philosophy had already been established. So now, the treatise clarifying the teachings and the compendium of the Abhidharma and the compendium of the Mahayana, if you ask, were these all written by a single person named Asanga, then it's difficult to say that exactly so. But if we look at the way they're put together, we think that they're at least related or linked to Asanga. But saying that this is just only categorically one historical Asanga who wrote them, that's a difficult postulate to make. So when you talk about, well, who was the historical Acharya Asanga then? So who is this historical Asanga? So it could have been that at the beginning, there were several practitioners who had views and ideas. They had views and ideas, the views from their meditation, right? That, they had similar vows that arose from their experience and realization, and then they had the same aim and basically the same system. And they took these views and thoughts and they compiled and reworked the material. And so that could be what the name refers to. If we say that it was that there was the reason why we can't say it's necessarily just a single person who wrote the compendium of the Abhidharma, the clarifying the teachings, and the compendium of the Mahayana is that one thing that happened in ancient India and also happens in this age is that when many people collaborate to create a text or a work, then they take the name of the most important or the most well-known person. Everyone works together, but they take the most well-known person's name and they accredited it to that one name. And so, for example, if we think about the compendium of the Mahayana, for example, it has been passed down over several centuries, right? And as it's become down to us over several centuries, there's a problem with a lot of editing done on it. For example, if we think about it in Tibetan, there have been many people who have proofread and edited the tantras, and when they proofread them, they might have slightly different understandings. And it seems that there may have been people who have added to them, people who have actually changed, either added or taken away parts of it. And so in that respect, we say that in the beginning, There was the text of the compendium of Mahayana that was written and the one that we can see now. So it's quite possible that there would be quite a few differences between the two. It's quite possible that there are so many differences, but you cannot categorically say that it was not written by a Sangha. And the reason for this is that even there have been many changes, but the still the text's earlier philosophical orientation still remains there, and it's not weakened and not diminished. So for that reason, we could say that it was written by a Sangha and use his name. But the way we think about things, when we say that a Sangha wrote something, what we now immediately think is that a Sangha himself then squirreled himself away in the depths of some house. He took a pen in his hand and he alone sat down writing everything himself, and then gave it directly to our hands. But we can't think of it in that way. And the reason is that the compendium of the Mahayana that we have in our hands now is not something that a Sangha wrote down himself and then placed in our hands. It came through many people for many hundreds of years, gone from one person to the next. And so how many times was it edited in between them? I mean, how many changes were made to the text? And when we look at this, there have been a lot of changes. There have been a whole lot of changes. Because there have been so many changes, the compendium of Mahayana that has come to our hands, if we say, this was written by a Sangha, if we say, we can't 100% say that a Sangha wrote 100% of the text. There's been so much editing and so many additions, so many subtractions that we can't definitely say that he wrote it. But we can't say that it wasn't written by a Sangha because the structure and the organization were all developed by a Sangha. And that was all taken based on that. So we can't say it wasn't. So what we need to think about it is that whether we think about the Yogacarya mind only or the many practitioners have considered a Sangha to be an incredibly important figure. And they've had very strong feeling, a profound feeling of blessings. And when they've had that strong feeling, and so when the way many people think of it like with the compendium of Mahayana, many people think that from the one perspective that they were spreading it. From another aspect, they were preserving the text. Another angle, they're also compiling and editing and adding and subtracting. And so if we think about it from another angle, what we should say is the people, it's the older generations who have given us the compendium Mahayana that we actually have. And so we should think of them with gratitude. And because of them, that we are actually able to hold in our hands the text of the compendium of the Mahayana. So this is another important point that we need to think about. So the next one is Vasubandu. And now Vasubandu was also similar to Asanga in that he first entered the foundation vehicle Sarvastivada, and he was well-known for being extremely intelligent. And he was so well regarded and famous as a scholar that so he was well known all over India. Later, if we talk about it in the traditional way, his elder brother Asanga, then under the influence by Asanga, he then entered the Mahayana, and then he compiled and organized the mind-only vow. He gave it an order and compiled it. And so he had a very strong effect on, left strong traces in the mind-only Yogacara view. So now, when you think about it, but there's some important points from the research about Vasubandhu. As I said in at the end of the 19th century, the academics studying Buddhism began to research the dates of Vasubandhu's birth and his death. And so beginning that, there was a great, the beginning of the research into the Yogacara and mind only. So the very beginning was that they were trying to determine the dates of Vasubandhu's birth and death. Now, at that time, there are two primary positions about Vasubandhu's dates. The first is that he was born in the 4th century, and the other was he was born in the 5th century. So there are these two positions. And so the idea they gave him two different sets of dates. And once there were the two sets of dates, in 1951, there was a scholar named Frau Wallner. And this scholar said, at that time, they had the two different positions, that he was in the 4th century and the 5th century. And so Frau Wallner took that as the basis and said that there must have been two Vasubandhus who appeared in one of the 2 centuries. And so you had the position that there were two Vasubandhus, one earlier and one later. And so what he's saying here is that it's basically saying there were two Vasubandhus. One appeared later and one appeared later. So he said there are two Vasubandhus. Now, we're not talking about how many people named Vasubandhu there were, but we're talking about the famous or the important people named Vasubandhu. There were two. So the earlier one, he said, was the Asanga, his younger brother, who lived in the 4th century, who, under the influence of Asanga, moved from being in the Sarvastivada tradition into being in the Mahayana. And so that was the earlier Vasubandhu. And so this is the Vasubandhu who entered the Mahayana, who wrote about the mind only. Then there was also the later Vasubandhu. And this is the author of the Treasury of the Abhidharma. And when he appeared was in the 5th century. And he was also originally a Sarvastivadian, and then later entered the Sutra school. And so that is how Frau Wallner explains it. Now, I can't really pronounce Frau Wallner, but within academics, there is a great interest in Frau Wallner's hypothesis of two Vasubandhus, and it was very influential. And it became generally accepted that there must have been two Vasubandhus. Now, the main sources that he used for his hypothesis were several different texts. And among them, the first set of these included the life of Vasubandhu translated into Chinese by Yi Jing. That was one of his important sources. The second was Xuanzang's records of his travels to India. The third was in terms of the Tibetan, Bhutan's Dharma history and Taranata's Dharma history. And so these were his primary sources. But these are the primarily, most of these are all basically traditional accounts. And so the I Ching's account was actually a traditional account. It's not that there was an actual historical distinction. It was the traditional account passed down from past masters. Tang Xuanzang's account records the traditional accounts that people told him that had been passed down from previous generations. And Bhutan's Dharma history and Taranata's Dharma history also primarily give the traditional accounts passed down from earlier masters. And so for that because there are very few written historical records about Vasubandhu himself. And so for that reason, he basically had a very strong attachment to the traditional accounts. And that's something we must understand. Now, the second set of the second source that he had, or the text attributed to Vasubandhu in the Chinese canon. In the Chinese canon, there are many different texts that are attributed to Vasubandhu, and so he used them as another source. Now, the third set was the accounts given in Vasumitra's commentary in the Treasure of Abhidharma and other commentaries by later masters. So basically, and so he used so these accounts given by later masters such as Vasumitra were a source that he used in coming up with this hypothesis. And so when we look at those, that the Vasubandu hypothesized that there were two Vasubandhus, but the sources that he used were primarily traditional accounts. So primarily they're traditional accounts, and if they're traditional accounts, they're just traditional accounts, oral accounts. Within there's a lot that must have been true stories, but they also have many made-up parts. So if we want to use traditional accounts to get an entirely clear picture of the actual historical, it's extremely difficult. So for this reason, there were probably quite a few people who objected to his postulate that there were two Vasubandhus at that time. Among them, there's a Japanese academic named Hirakawa Akira who writes that what he says is, in India, there are many different texts that are said to be written by one famous person. This is like a tradition. Even though they weren't written by the same person, there is a tradition of saying that they're written by the same person. In particular, the Vasubandhu, there is also Vasumitra. And these two names in Sanskrit are very well known. And the reason for that is that the word Vasu is the name of a god. Because it's the name of a god, many people have such faith in the god that they call it Vasu this, Vasu that. And so there's a tradition of naming people Vasu. Likewise, if we look in the Buddhist histories, we can't necessarily say there's no certainty that there's Vasubandhu as just one person. In fact, there are many Vasubandhus in Buddhist history. Also within the Yogacaryas, the Vasubandhus are considered Yogacaryas to be very famous and important. So it's quite possible that they would say that the author of their text would have been Vasubandhu. For example, I'd like to give it as like if we think about it in terms of Tibet. This is not something that the Japanese scholar said, but in order to make it easy for us, we need to use a Tibetan example, right? So what we Tibetans say, We say that so even if there's not even there's no place in Tibet where our Guru Rinpoche has gone. So wherever you go in Tibet, if you go any place you go, Rinpoche said this, and there's Rinpoche's footprint and so forth. But if you think about an actual history, now of course this can happen in pure visions, but in the actual historical basis, when Guru Rinpoche went to Tibet, basically, most people say he spent no more than 18 months. And so in 18 months, it would be difficult to go to all the places in Tibet. No, if he went by miraculous powers, and this would have been pure visions, but in our common perceptions, he couldn't have gone. Of course, he could have gone by miraculous visions and common perception, but most people, but when you talk about too many miraculous or incredible things, it's just not something that fits within our common perceptions. So in Tibet, no matter where you go, there are stories about Guru Rinpoche. And so in India, with the Yogacharyas, when they had their important texts, they would say this is written by their earlier famous masters. Likewise, when you think about the Yogacharyas, they're primarily practitioners, right? And because they are practitioners, they considered their deities and their gurus to be extremely important. And so in order to show their devotion and respect, they would use it. It happened that they would use their name. We can't say you aren't allowed to do that. These people had such great faith, and they used it out of faith and devotion. They aren't use it in order to show themselves off. And we can't say that it's not right to use the names in that way. In any case, we have the traditional accounts of Vasubandu's life translated into Chinese by Yi Jing. These are primarily traditional accounts. And if we use them, rely on them too heavily as our sources, then this leads to the situation that there are a lot of questions and debates about things such as the dates of Vasubandu. So one person will say that this is will follow the tradition of Yi Jing, another will follow another person, and between the two of them, we're going to say that my source is better than yours, and you can't necessarily that it's difficult to say categorically that it's not so. And this happens within Tibet. If you have some great scholar, if this scholar says, and if you don't accept it, then you're not considering that scholar to be learned. And that's how we see it, isn't it? And so we'd always be saying who is being disrespectful to whom, and we'd be continually in debate. So in brief, when we're researching Indian history and researching the Yogacara history, the difficult thing is that there are not any actual factual historical differences. There aren't any ancient written historical manuscripts. And because there aren't these, and if everything is a traditional account or an oral account, it's not reliable. It's not certain. And because it's not certain, or then we're thinking about historical persons or the events of history, it's impossible to say it happened exactly when it happened. And this leads to many debates. So what I often think is that the ancient Indian people didn't think about future generations at all. At that time, they thought nothing about the future generations. And they're so amazed by what's happening in front of them. And thinking, if I see this is fine. And they didn't think at all about the people of the future. Forget about them. We can't forget about anything else. We can't even say the date that the Buddha passed into pure party nirvana with any certainty. At the time that the Buddha was in there, there are many different kings. And if the kings had it recorded, if they had recorded it in their palaces somehow, we'd have something we could look at. But they didn't record anything. They didn't write a single word about it. And so when Ashoka wrote a few words on pillars, and we can then have some confidence that there was a Buddha who appeared, and that he probably was probably born in this century. We can probably guess this, right? But otherwise, if Ashoka hadn't carved these inscriptions in pillars, then forget about when the Buddha, the dates of the Buddha's appearance. Then it would be difficult for us to have any evidence at all that the Buddha had appeared. We would say there was just a Buddha that appeared. It's written on later histories, but we need some evidence. Modern people need some evidence from that time, and finding the evidence would be extremely difficult. So the rock inscriptions and pillars of Ashoka were really beneficial, but if the earlier kings had done that, then it would have been great. They didn't make any inscriptions, and because they didn't make any inscriptions, and most of the history basically comes from Indian oral histories and Tibetan oral histories. And we look at the Tibetan and so there's just one person saying something to another. So it's different because they're noticing. Basically, from one person saying an oral into another person's ear and hearing it. If we think about it, the stories of our own histories, if we talk about this, you say if you tell one person your life story one day and you tell it to someone else the next day, it changes a little bit, right? It changes. It changes. And so when you tell it yourself, there changes. And when that person then tells it to someone else, then of course it's going to change a bit more. And if it goes through 100 people, then you have no idea what's going to come out at the end. There's a danger that they'll say things that you did things you didn't do, that you didn't do things you did do, and so there'll be absolutely no certainty in evidence. Now, of course, there are probably actual events in there, historical events, but that you can't say that there's nothing true in it, but there's a lot of difficulty otherwise. So, but this is not saying that it's 100% not correct. So now we will have our 30-minute intermission.